Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the strange and sleepy corners of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that are just interesting enough to distract you from the fact that you're still awake. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of pretty tragic tale of the Queen who dreamed of being a turnipi, a story of royal discontent, agrarian longing, and the peculiar allure of root vegetables. Chapter 1. The royal obsession begins. The Queen was bored. This was not an unusual state for Her Majesty, for the life of a monarch, despite its gilded trappings, was often as thrilling as watching paint dry on a castle wall. Courtiers droned on about tariffs and treaties, the jousting tournaments had grown predictable, and even the royal chef's famously elaborate pies had lost their charm. The Queen sighed, tapping her fingers against the armrest of her throne, wondering if this was all there would ever be. A never-ending parade of obligations, flattery, and the faint nagging sense that somewhere beyond the palace walls life was happening without her. It was on one such afternoon, as she listlessly gazed out the palace window, that she first saw the turnips. A group of peasants were hauling them in from the fields, their backs bent under the weight of sacks brimming with the humble vegetables. There was nothing remarkable about the scene, just another day in the kingdom's unending cycle of sowing and reaping. But something about it snagged the Queen's attention like a thorn on silk. Perhaps it was the way the peasants laughed as they worked, their faces ruddy from the sun, their hands calloused but quick. Perhaps it was the simplicity of it all. No scheming courtiers, no labyrinthine politics, just dirt and labor and the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. Or perhaps it was the turnips themselves, plump, unpretentious, and blissfully free from the burden of crowns. From that moment on, the Queen could think of little else. She began dismissing her attendants early, claiming fatigue, only to sneak away to the palace gardens, where she would stare at the vegetable patches with an intensity usually reserved for matters of state. She ordered the royal botanist to deliver detailed reports on turnip cultivation, nodding solemnly as he explained crop rotation and soil acidity, as if these were the secrets of the universe. At state dinners she ignored the roasted pheasant in favor of nibbling on boiled turnips, much to the horror of the visiting dignitaries, who had not traveled all this way to watch a monarch eat like a peasant. The court, naturally, was baffled. Whispers slithered through the halls like serpents in a garden. Had the Queen gone mad? Was this some elaborate ruse? The Chancellor, a man who believed all problems could be solved with enough paperwork, suggested that perhaps Her Majesty merely needed a new hobby: embroidery, falconry, or better yet, a politically advantageous marriage proposal. But the Queen waved him away, her eyes distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the palace settled into its usual rhythm of candlelight and murmured conspiracies, the Queen did something unprecedented. She slipped out of the palace entirely, disguised in a simple woolen dress borrowed from a scullery maid, and made her way to the fields where the turnips grew. The night air was cool, the earth damp beneath her bare feet. She had, in her haste, forgotten shoes, and for the first time in years she felt awake. Kneeling in the dirt, she ran her fingers over the turnip greens, marveling at their roughness, their unapologetic plainness. Here was a life uncomplicated by crowns or expectations. Here, she thought, was freedom. Of course, this was only the beginning of the Queen's peculiar obsession, and the court had no idea what was coming. But as she crouched there in the moonlight, her royal robes discarded like a discarded husk, the Queen made a silent vow. One day, somehow, she would know the peace of being a turnip. Chapter 2. The Court's Bewilderment. The Queen's sudden preoccupation with turnips did not go unnoticed for long. A monarch could not disappear into the vegetable patches at odd hours, smelling faintly of damp earth and root cellars, without someone eventually remarking upon it. And so the whispers began, quiet at first, cautious, as though the courtiers were unsure whether this was a passing fancy or the first sign of a royal unraveling. The first to voice concern was Lord Pembroke, a man whose primary talent was looking deeply concerned about things he did not understand. He cornered the Chancellor after a particularly baffling council meeting, during which the Queen had spent the entire discussion sketching turnips in the margins of a trade agreement. "This cannot continue," Pembroke hissed, his mustache quivering with the gravity of his distress. "Her Majesty has taken to comparing tax policies to crop yields. Yesterday she asked if we might solve the kingdom's debt by planting more turnips and waiting patiently." The Chancellor, a veteran of royal eccentricities, merely sighed and adjusted his spectacles. "It's a phase," he said, though he sounded less convinced than he would have liked. "Remember when King Alfred became obsessed with badgers? That passed." "But badgers are noble creatures," protested Lady Eleanora, who had been eavesdropping, as was her habit. "Turnips are, well, they're turnips." The court's confusion only deepened when the Queen began hosting what she called agricultural audiences. Instead of receiving petitioners in the Grand Hall, she now insisted on meeting them in the palace gardens, seated on a simple wooden stool between the carrot beds and the cabbage patch. Diplomats accustomed to pomp and ceremony found themselves standing ankle-deep in mulch while the Queen expounded on the virtues of well-drained soil. The ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of Iridia, a man who had spent weeks preparing a speech on mutual defense pacts, was instead treated to a lengthy demonstration on how a turnip was ripe. Then came the royal decree. It arrived one morning, nailed to the castle gates by a bewildered herald who had been given no explanation. The document was brief, written in the Queen's own hand, and it declared that henceforth the first day of every month would be celebrated as the festival of the humble turnip. There would be feasting, of course, though the menu would consist entirely of turnip-based dishes, and a grand competition in which subjects could present their finest specimens for judging. The winner would receive a silver platter, engraved naturally with a turnip, and the honor of having their crop declared most admirable root of the realm. The court was aghast. "This is an outrage," sputtered the Duke of Marwick, a man whose idea of peasant interaction was shouting at them to get off his lawn. "We are a kingdom of laws and legacy, not vegetable pageantry." Yet the common folk, much to the nobility's dismay, took to the idea with surprising enthusiasm. Farmers, who had never before dared approach the palace, now arrived in droves, clutching their prized turnips like sacred relics. The Queen, delighted, wandered among them, asking questions about irrigation and pest control as though these were matters of state, which in her mind they now were. The court's attempts to curb her fixation only made things worse. When the Chancellor suggested that perhaps Her Majesty might consider a different hobby, archery, for instance, or alchemy, the Queen responded by commissioning a tapestry depicting the history of turnip cultivation from ancient times to the present day. When Lady Eleanora delicately mentioned that the royal wardrobe was beginning to smell distinctly earthy, the Queen simply shrugged and ordered a new gown dyed turnip green. The breaking point came during a banquet held in honor of the visiting Prince Florian, a man whose entire existence revolved around hunting, horses, and not being laughed at. The Queen, in a moment of what she considered inspired hospitality, had the kitchens prepare a half-course meal in which every dish, from soup to dessert, contained turnips. The prince, after bravely choking down a turnip custard, was heard muttering to his entourage that he had eaten battleships that were less dense. By now, the whispers had grown into a steady hum of gossip. Some speculated that the Queen had been enchanted, perhaps by a disgruntled sorcerer or a particularly persuasive farmer. Others feared she was ill, her mind addled by some mysterious malady that made her see profundity in tubers. A few of the more superstitious servants crossed themselves whenever she passed, as though she were a walking omen of agrarian doom. Only the royal gardener, a grizzled old man named Thaddeus, seemed unbothered by the whole affair. When asked by the kitchen staff if he thought the Queen had lost her senses, he merely chuckled and wiped his hands on his apron. "People forget," he said, "that a turnip's just a thing that grows. It doesn't worry about crowns or coin? Maybe Her Majesty's got the right idea." Meanwhile, the Queen herself remained blissfully unaware of the chaos she had sown. She spent her evenings poring over botanical texts, her mornings walking the rows of the palace garden, and her afternoons drafting plans for a royal turnip reserve. The court could whisper all it liked. She had never been happier. Little did they know, her obsession was about to take an even stranger turn. Chapter 3. The Royal Decree of Vegetable Equality. The Queen's fascination with turnips had already upended courtly decorum, but no one, not even the most pessimistic of her advisers, could have predicted what came next. It began, as so many terrible ideas do, with a moment of absolute certainty in the sovereign's mind. One crisp morning, as she stood barefoot in the royal gardens marveling at a particularly well-formed turnip, it struck her with the force of divine revelation. If a turnip could bring her such profound joy, why should it not be accorded the same respect as, say a duke? She drafted the proclamation that very afternoon. The Royal Decree of Vegetable Equality was a document both brief and bewildering. In neat, looping script, the Queen declared that henceforth turnips were to be recognized as noble vegetables, equal in dignity and station to the landed aristocracy of the realm. They were to be addressed with proper titles. A particularly robust specimen might be styled Your Tuberosity, granted the right to symbolic representation at court, and, most alarmingly, given parcels of land to cultivate as they saw fit. The final clause, added almost as an afterthought, noted that any nobleman who disparaged a turnip would be fined no less than 3 sacks of the finest compost. The herald tasked with announcing the decree hesitated before reading it aloud in the palace square. He was a man who had delivered declarations of war, royal betrothals, and even the occasional plague ordinance, but never before had he been asked to publicly elevate root vegetables to peerage. Nevertheless, duty compelled him. As his voice echoed across the gathered crowd, a stunned silence fell, followed inevitably by uproar. The nobility reacted as though personally insulted by the soil itself. The Duke of Marek, upon hearing that he was now legally equivalent to a slightly blemished but earnest turnip from the southern provinces, turned such a violent shade of purple that his physician was summoned in a panic. Lady Eleonora fainted directly into a waiting footman's arms, though whether from outrage or the tightness of her corset remained unclear. Even the usually unflappable Chancellor found himself at a loss, staring blankly at the proclamation, as though hoping it might spontaneously combust. The peasants, meanwhile, were delighted. Farmers who had spent their lives toiling in obscurity now arrived at court clutching their best turnips like newborn heirs, demanding titles and land grants. A particularly cunning cabbage farmer from the eastern valleys tried to argue that his produce deserved similar recognition, but the Queen, though sympathetic, gently reminded him that the decree was strictly a turnip matter, at least for now. Chaos rippled through the kingdom's legal systems. Magistrates were forced to adjudicate disputes between noblemen and turnips, a task for which no precedent existed. One case involved a count who had allegedly defamed a prize-winning turnip by calling it lumpy and unexceptional at a dinner party. The turnip, represented by its farmer, won the suit, and the count was ordered to publicly apologize while holding the offending vegetable on a velvet cushion. Diplomatic relations suffered. The aforementioned Prince Florian, upon learning of the decree during a subsequent visit, snorted into his wine and declared that his kingdom would never acknowledge vegetable gentry. The Queen, unperturbed, responded by gifting him a basket of turnips, knighted for the occasion, sere tuber of roasting pan among them. The prince left in a huff, and rumors soon spread that Viridia was reconsidering its trade agreements with a nation that had lost all sense of proportion. Even the church was drawn into the fray. The bishop, a man who had weathered heresies, schisms, and the occasional haunted cathedral, found himself presiding over an impromptu debate on whether turnips had souls. Traditionalists argued that only God's human creations could aspire to salvation, while a growing faction of radical clerics, many of whom came from farming families, insisted that if a turnip could inspire such devotion in their queen, surely the Almighty had a place for it in his garden. The bishop, after a long and despairing silence, suggested they table the discussion until after harvest season. Through it all, the queen remained serene. She took to holding open court in the vegetable gardens, where supplicants, human and turnip alike, could present their grievances. Her judgments were eccentric but not unkind. A farmer who had accidentally beheaded a titled turnip while harvesting was pardoned after an emotional appeal about hunger and necessity. A turnip accused of rolling menacingly toward a nobleman's prized rose bushes was acquitted for lack of malicious intent. Yet unrest simmered. The nobles, though initially too stunned to act, began to murmur in corners. The chancellor, watching tax revenues dwindle as the kingdom's reputation veered into farce, grew increasingly grim. Even the common folk, though amused, wondered how long a realm could function when its monarch's attention was fixed so firmly underground. And then, as autumn faded into winter, the queen made her most audacious move yet. She announced that she would be stepping back from her royal duties. Temporarily, she assured everyone, to better understand the turnip's quiet wisdom. The kingdom would be left in the hands of a council of ministers, farmers, and, yes, a few select turnips of proven judgment. The court held its breath. The peasants whispered. Somewhere in the quiet dark of the royal cellars, a particularly ambitious turnip sat waiting, its time come at last. Chapter 4. The Failed Turnip Transformation Ritual. The queen's retreat from royal duties did not bring the peace the court had hoped for. If anything, her absence only deepened the kingdom's turmoil. Ministers bickered over turnip-related legislation, farmers demanded their vegetables be granted voting rights, and the nobles, still smarting from their demotion to root-adjacent status, plotted in hushed tones. But the queen, tucked away in her private gardens, cared little for the chaos she had unleashed. She had a new purpose now, one that eclipsed all former concerns of state. She would become a turnip. It began with alchemists. The queen summoned practitioners of the arcane arts from across the realm, promising gold and titles to anyone who could achieve the impossible. The first to arrive was a gaunt man named Master Theobald, who claimed to have once transformed a frog into a moderately convincing loaf of bread. He set up his apparatus in the palace's old conservatory, where bubbling alembics and copper coils soon crowded out the potted ferns. His plan, explained between dramatic pauses, involved distilling the essence of turnip into a tincture so potent that drinking it would cause a fundamental shift in the queen's humors, aligning her very being with that of her beloved vegetable. The resulting potion was a viscous green liquid that smelled like a damp cellar and tasted, according to the queen, like regret. She drank it anyway. For 3 days, she lay abed, her skin taking on a faintly waxy pallor, her hands occasionally twitching as though seeking soil. The court physicians hovered nervously, unsure whether to prescribe bleeding or fertilizer. On the 4th morning, she sat up, declared that she felt exceptionally tuberous, and demanded to be carried to the garden to see if roots had begun to sprout from her feet. None had. Master Theobald, sensing his payment slipping away, hastily suggested that perhaps the transformation was internal, a spiritual tourneyfood, as it were, and that further testing was required. The queen, though disappointed, allowed him to continue his work. The next attempt came from Madame Zelda, a witch of some local renown who specialized in love potions, wart removal, and when pressed, minor weather manipulation. She dismissed Master Theobald's approach as bookish nonsense, and proposed instead a ritual involving chanting, a great deal of beetroot juice, the closest substitute she could find for turnip essence on short notice, and a moonlit dance in which the queen was to wriggle progressively closer to the earth, like a sprout seeking the sun. The queen, game for anything that might bring her closer to her ideal, complied. The sight of the monarch writhing in the dirt, robed in beet-stained linen, while Madame Zelda shook a rattle made of dried gourds, did little to reassure the handful of courtiers who had not yet abandoned all hope. When dawn came without so much as a single leafy shoot emerging from the royal scalp, Madame Zelda blamed cosmic misalignment and recommended trying again during a more auspicious planetary configuration. The queen, her back aching from a night of enthusiastic contortions, agreed, but insisted they source actual turnip juice for the next attempt. Meanwhile, whispers of the queen's endeavors had reached the ears of Brother Anselm, a reclusive monk who dabbled in experimental theology. He arrived at court uninvited, clutching a parchment scroll that purported to explain the metaphysical intersection of plant and monarch. His theory, delivered in a voice that suggested he had not spoken to another human in at least a decade, was that the queen's soul already resembled a turnip, simple, unpretentious, and deeply grounded, and that what she needed was not transformation but recognition. To that end, he proposed a sacrament in which the queen would be symbolically buried in a specially consecrated patch of earth, then resurrected as a true child of the soil. The queen, intrigued, agreed. The ritual was conducted in secret, away from the prying eyes of the court. For 3 nights she lay in a shallow grave, covered by a thin layer of compost, while Brother Anselm recited psalms adapted to praise root vegetables. Blessed art thou among tubers, for thou shalt feed the hungry. On the 4th morning she emerged, damp and disoriented, but still disappointingly human. Brother Anselm, undeterred, declared the experiment a partial success, noting that her fingernails had accumulated a respectable amount of dirt, which he deemed a promising start. By now, the queen's obsession had drawn more dubious figures to the palace. A self-proclaimed vegetable whisperer from a distant land promised to teach her to communicate with turnips psychically. A traveling surgeon offered to graft turnip skins directly onto her arms, creating a living symbiosis. One particularly enterprising charlatan sold her a tonic, guaranteed to turnipify the humors within a week. It turned her urine a startling shade of purple, but otherwise had no discernible effect. The final and most disastrous attempt came from Dr. Ignatius Porphyry, an alchemist of questionable credentials but undeniable showmanship. He arrived with a wagon full of gleaming apparatus, a cloak lined with astrological symbols, and a plan so audacious that even the queen hesitated before agreeing. His proposal was to distill the queen's very essence into a liquid form, then infuse it into the heart of a living turnip, thereby transferring her consciousness into the vegetable, while preserving her royal dignity. The apparatus for this endeavor was elaborate. A great glass retort in which the queen's vital vapors would be collected, a silver funnel for spiritual decanting, and a specially selected turnip of noble proportions, dubbed the vessel. The procedure began at midnight, as such things often do. The queen sat in a chair of braided willow while Dr. Porphyry burned pungent herbs, and chanted in a language he later admitted was mostly made up. The courtiers who had gathered to watch, some concerned, others merely morbidly curious, shifted uneasily as the air grew thick with smoke and the scent of overcooked parsnip. Then something went wrong. Whether it was a miscalculation in the alchemical process, or simply the universe's refusal to countenance such absurdity, the retort exploded in a shower of glass and greenish steam. The force of the blast knocked Dr. Porphyry into a decorative hedge, singed the queen's eyebrows, and sent the vessel rolling across the floor, where it was promptly eaten by the royal spaniel. Silence fell. The queen, her face smudged with soot, stared at the wreckage. Then, to everyone's surprise, she began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, then grew into a full-bodied guffaw that left her wheezing and wiping tears from her eyes. The The courtiers, unsure whether this was hysteria or enlightenment, exchanged nervous glances. When she finally caught her breath, the queen stood, brushed a shard of glass from her sleeve, and announced that she had come to a realization. Perhaps, she mused, one cannot become a turnip, but one can appreciate them deeply, perhaps even excessively, without literal metamorphosis. She thanked Dr. Porphyry for his efforts, though she declined to pay for the damages, and dismissed the assembled alchemists, witches, and theologians with a wave of her hand. That night, she dined alone in her chambers, enjoying a simple meal of buttered turnips, roasted turnips, and a turnip pudding for dessert. And if, as she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of cool earth and quiet growth, well, that was no one's business but her own. The court, meanwhile, dared to hope that the madness had passed. They would soon learn otherwise. Chapter 5. The Peasant Who Understood. News of the Queen's failed transmutation spread through the kingdom, like blight through a cabbage patch. The nobility, who had spent the last several months oscillating between outrage and exhausted resignation, allowed themselves a collective sigh of relief. Surely now, they reasoned, the monarch would return to her senses, dismiss the alchemists, and restore some semblance of order to the realm. The farmers, meanwhile, chuckled into their ale and placed bets on what madness she might attempt next. But the queen was not yet finished. Though she had abandoned her quest for physical transformation, her devotion to the turnip had not waned. She still wandered the gardens at odd hours, murmuring to the vegetables as though they were trusted advisers. She still insisted on turnip-based feasts, much to the despair of the royal chef, who had exhausted every possible culinary variation on the theme. And most bewildering of all, she had taken to sitting in the fields during rainstorms, claiming she wanted to understand the turnip's experience of weather from the ground up. It was during one of these damp vigils that she met the peasant. His name was Hob, and he had farmed the same patch of land for 30 years. He was a wiry man with hands like knotted roots and a face weathered by sun and wind. He had watched the queen's antics from a distance, amused but unsurprised. In his experience, nobles were prone to odd notions, and at least this one wasn't taxing him to fund another pointless war. On this particular afternoon, he found her kneeling in his turnip field, heedless of the mud soaking into her skirts, staring intently at a row of leafy greens as though they might whisper secrets to her. Hope cleared his throat, not out of deference, but because he had recently developed a cough that refused to leave. The queen looked up, blinking rain from her lashes. "Ah," she said, as though it were perfectly ordinary to find one's sovereign squatting in a field. "You must be the farmer." "Aye," said Hope. "And you're the queen." She nodded, undeterred by his lack of ceremony. "Tell me," she said, gesturing to the turnips, "what do you suppose they think about?" Hope scratched his chin. "Doubt they think much, your majesty. They're turnips." The queen frowned. "But surely they must feel something. The sun on their leaves, the rain in their soil. Don't you ever wonder if they're happy?" Hope sighed. He had spent most of his life worrying about whether his crops would grow, whether his family would eat, whether the taxes would leave him enough to survive the winter. The emotional lives of vegetables had never crossed his mind. Still, the queen was looking at him with a sort of earnest expectation usually seen in children and very confused dogs, so he humored her. "Suppose they're happy enough," he said. "Until harvest." The queen gasped. "Harvest? Oh, but that's murder." Hope stared at her. "It's dinner." The queen looked stricken. She placed a protective hand over the nearest turnip, as though shielding it from his callous words. "But don't you see? They grow, they thrive, they live, and then you tear them from the earth, and—" "Boil them," Hope supplied helpfully. The queen made a noise somewhere between a whimper and a hiccup. Bob, who had neither the time nor the patience for aristocratic existential crises, decided to take a different tack. "Tell you what," he said. "You want to know the life of a turnip? Try it." The queen brightened. "You mean—" "Not like that," Hob said, forestalling another alchemical disaster. I mean proper turnip work. Plant 'em, tend 'em, pull 'em up when they're ready. See what it's really like. The Queen clasped her hands together. Oh, yes, I shall be a turnip farmer. Hope opened his mouth to point out that she was already technically a turnip farmer, given that all the land in the kingdom belonged to her, but she was already marching toward the nearby shed, calling for a hoe and a pair of proper peasant trousers. Thus began the Queen's brief but enthusiastic career in agriculture. She took to the work with the same fervor she had once applied to matters of state. She rose at dawn, her hands wrapped in linen to protect them from blisters, and set about weeding, watering, and generally fussing over the turnips like a mother hen. Hope, who had expected her to abandon the endeavor by midday, found himself grudgingly impressed by her persistence, if not her skill. She was, to put it kindly, a terrible farmer. She overwatered the seedlings, drowning half the crop in her enthusiasm. She sang to the turnips, which Hob maintained was unnerving the livestock. She named each vegetable, Sir Tuberous the Brave, Lady Turnipina of the Loamy Vale, and became distraught when Hob casually mentioned thinning the weaker plants. You can't just execute them for being small. Worse still, she refused to accept the fundamental truth of farming. Nature was cruel. When pests descended on the young shoots, she ordered the royal guards to stand watch with nets, attempting to catch every offending beetle by hand. When a late frost threatened the crop, she insisted on draping each plant in scraps of velvet from her own wardrobe. Despite Hob's protests that they're not going to a ball, they're going in a stew. And then came the harvest. The Queen had managed, through sheer stubbornness, to keep a few turnips alive to maturity. Hope, who had spent the season alternating between amusement and exasperation, handed her a spade and gestured to the field. Go on then, see what all the fuss is about. The Queen hesitated. But they're not ready. They're as ready as they'll ever be, but they're still growing. Hope rubbed his temples. That's the point, Your Majesty. You grow 'em, you pull 'em, you eat 'em. That's the way of it. The Queen looked down at the turnips, then at the spade, then at Hob. Her lower lip trembled. It's barbaric. Hope, who had spent the last month watching this woman try to negotiate with aphids, finally lost patience. Oh, give it here. He snatched the spade and in one swift motion dug up a turnip, knocked the dirt from its roots, and dropped it into her hands. The Queen stared at it, her eyes wide. The turnip, freshly unearthed, was undeniably handsome, plump, golden, and still damp with earth. It was also, very clearly, dead. Oh, she said softly. Hope crossed his arms. Aye, oh. The Queen sat down heavily in the dirt, cradling the turnip like a fallen comrade. Hope, feeling slightly guilty, crouched beside her. Look, he said, you wanted to know the life of a turnip? This is it. They grow, we eat 'em, we plant more. That's the way it's always been. Not much dignity in it, but there's truth. The Queen was silent for a long moment. Then, to Hob's horror, she began to cry. Not the delicate, courtly weeping of a noblewoman, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Hope, who had faced droughts, wolves, and once a very determined badger, found himself utterly unprepared for this development. He patted her shoulder awkwardly. There now, it's just a turnip. But it's not, the Queen wailed. It's everything. It's life and death and futility. Hope sighed. He was a farmer, not a philosopher. But he supposed even queens needed to learn the same hard truths eventually. Aye, he said. That it is. The Queen sniffled. And you do this every year. Twice, if the weather holds. She looked at the turnip in her hands, then at the field, then at Hob. Something in her face shifted. Not resignation, exactly, but a kind of understanding. Slowly, she stood, brushed the dirt from her trousers, and squared her shoulders. Very well, she said. Let's cook it. Hope blinked. Eh? If this is the way of things, the Queen said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, then we should honor it properly. No more velvet shrouds, no more alchemy, just turnips. Hope, despite himself, smiled. Aye, he said, just turnips. And so the Queen of the realm, still sniffling, helped Hob prepare the most ordinary of meals. Boiled turnips, mashed turnips, and a humble turnip stew. It was, by all accounts, delicious. Back at the palace, the courtiers waited nervously for their monarch's next grand proclamation. Little did they know, she was already drafting it, this time with dirt under her nails and a new, hard-won wisdom in her heart. Chapter 6. The Great Turnip Banquet Disaster. The Queen's agricultural enlightenment did nothing to diminish her enthusiasm for turnips. If anything, her time toiling in Hob's field had given her a new missionary zeal. She now viewed the humble root vegetable not just as an object of fascination, but as the solution to all the kingdom's problems, from trade deficits to spiritual malaise. And what better way to share this revelation than through the universal language of food? The invitations went out on parchment dyed turnip purple, edged with gold leaf in the shape of leaves. Her Majesty requests the pleasure of your company at the grand celestial turnip banquet, they proclaimed, a culinary celebration of our kingdom's most noble vegetable. The nobility read these words with growing dread. They remembered all too well the 12-course turnip ordeal Prince Florian had endured. But refusal was not an option when the monarch commanded attendance. The palace kitchens became a war zone. The royal chef, a temperamental artist who had once studied under the great masters of continental cuisine, threatened to resign no less than 7 times during preparations. Your Majesty, he pleaded during one particularly heated exchange, even the good Lord rested on the 7th day. Must we really make turnip soufflé? The Queen, who had personally approved all 68 dishes on the menu, remained unmoved. Consider it a creative challenge, he said, patting his flour-dusted shoulder before wandering off to inspect the turnip ice cream experiment. The banquet hall had been transformed into a vegetable wonderland. Arches of braided turnip greens framed the entrance. Centerpieces featured turnips carved into the likenesses of the kingdom's past monarchs, an artistic choice that inadvertently made several ancestors appear alarmingly lumpy. The Queen herself appeared in a new gown, the color of freshly peeled turnip flesh, with a headdress of delicate turnip flowers that trembled with her every movement. The guests arrived in various states of apprehension. The Duke of Marwick came armed with a flask of brandy hidden in his doublet. Lady Eleonora brought her own subtle seasoning of salt and pepper, concealed in a lace handkerchief. Even the usually unflappable Chancellor looked queasy as he eyed the first course, a clear turnip consommé that stared back at him like swamp water. Dinner began with what the Queen proudly announced as a symphony of turnip. The appetizer course featured turnip tartare, turnip foam on toasted turnip bread, and something the menu described as deconstructed turnip essence that resembled a small wet leaf on an otherwise empty plate. The bishop blessed the meal with what several guests noted was suspiciously quick brevity, as if afraid the food might become sentient during prolonged prayer. By the third course, a dubious turnip surprise that contained no actual surprise, just more turnip, the whispers began. Lord Pembroke was caught trying to slip morsels to the dogs, only to discover even the hounds turned up their noses. The ambassador from Viridia, a veteran of many diplomatic feasts, quietly asked if the kitchen had perhaps mistaken banquet for penance. The Queen, floating between tables in her turnip-hued splendor, remained oblivious to the suffering around her. The breaking point came with the main course, a whole roasted turnip the size of a baby's head, presented with its own miniature crown and scepter. "Behold the turnip king," the Queen announced as servers carried in the monstrous vegetable. A collective groan rose from the assembled nobility, their digestive systems already rebelling against the unrelenting starch. The Duke of Marek, his face taking on a distinctly turnip-like pallor, stood abruptly. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, if I eat one more bite of turnip, I cannot be held responsible for my actions." A dangerous murmur of agreement spread through the hall. The Queen blinked, her turnip flower headdress bobbing in confusion. "But we haven't even served the turnip pudding yet, or the turnip custard, or the Lord—" It was at this precise moment that the first projectile flew. Historians would later debate whether it was Lord Pembroke or the Countess of Wexford who first launched their roasted turnip king across the table, but the effect was immediate. Soon the air was thick with flying turnips. A well-aimed turnip flan splattered across the Chancellor's ceremonial robes. The bishop took a direct hit from a turnip croquette to the forehead. Through the vegetable shrapnel, the Queen stood frozen in shock as her dream dinner dissolved into anarchy. The riot only ended when the royal guards intervened, though several were seen nibbling on the ammunition with what some considered treasonous enthusiasm. As the last rebellious noble was escorted out, still clutching a turnip roll as both trophy and potential weapon, the Queen surveyed the wreckage of her grand vision. The floor was slippery with pureed turnip. The tapestries would never be the same. And in the center of it all sat the original turnip king, miraculously unharmed, its roasted face seeming to smirk up at her. In the silence that followed, a single figure approached. Hope the peasant, invited as guest of honor but until now too intimidated to speak, cleared his throat. "Might be," he ventured carefully, "that there's such a thing as too much turnip." The Queen opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. She looked at the room in Banquet Hall, at the stray globs of turnip clinging to the chandeliers, at the kitchen staff peering nervously from the doorway. Slowly, the absurdity of it all dawned on her. A giggle escaped her lips, then another, until she was laughing so hard, her turnip flower headdress came loose and tumbled into a puddle of turnip grape. The next morning, a simple notice appeared on the palace gates. By order of Her Majesty, it read, "The festival of the humble turnip shall henceforth be celebrated with moderation, variety, and, on special occasions, the optional inclusion of other vegetables." It was signed, for the first time in months, without a turnip-shaped seal. And in the kitchens, the royal chef wept tears of joy as he unpacked his long-neglected spices, already planning a menu that included, blessed be, not a single turnip. Chapter 7. The diplomatic incident with the turnip ambassador. The Queen had learned moderation, or so the court had hoped. The disastrous banquet had tempered her enthusiasm, if not her devotion, and for several weeks the kingdom enjoyed a brief respite from turnip-related absurdity. The festival of the humble turnip was scaled back to a single dignified ceremony, though the silver turnip platter remained the highest agricultural honor one could receive. The royal menus returned to a reasonable variety of meats, grains, and, yes, occasionally, turnips, but no longer in every conceivable form at every meal. The nobles, still recovering from their culinary trauma, dared to believe the madness had passed. They were, of course, catastrophically wrong. The trouble began when the Queen received word that Prince Florian of Viridia was finally willing to reopen trade negotiations, so long as no root vegetables were involved. The kingdom needed this alliance. Their treasury was still recovering from the disastrous turnip equality laws, and Viridia's access to southern spice routes would be invaluable. The Queen, eager to mend relations, immediately began planning. Her first mistake was consulting with Hob, who had somehow become her unofficial advisor on all matters turnip-related. Diplomacy is like farming, he mused over a shared lunch, a balanced meal that included, but was not dominated by, turnips. You plant the seeds, give them time to grow, and hope the weather holds. The Queen nodded solemnly, as if this were profound wisdom rather than common sense. Exactly. And what better way to demonstrate our commitment to growth than by sending a turnip as our emissary? Hope Michu froze. Eh? Not just any turnip, the Queen continued, her eyes lighting with familiar zeal. A turnip of noble bearing, one that embodies our kingdom's values, humble yet resilient, earthy yet refined. Hope swallowed with difficulty. Your Majesty, I don't think. It's perfect, she declared, already rising from the table. They'll see we're a nation of innovation, of bold thinking. What better way to put the past behind us than with a symbolic gesture? Hope opened his mouth to explain that sending a vegetable as a diplomat was the opposite of putting things behind them. But the Queen was already sweeping out the door, calling for the royal gardener. 3 days later, Sir Tuberous the diplomat was born. The chosen turnip was, admittedly, impressive. Plump, golden, and free of blemishes, with a dignified heft that suggested wisdom beyond its years. The Queen had it carefully preserved in beeswax to prevent rot, dressed in a tiny velvet robe embroidered with the royal crest, and placed in a cushioned box lined with satin. A small plaque affixed to the lid declared its official title, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Kingdom, His Excellency Sir Tuberous of the Loamy Vale. The court was aghast. The Chancellor, upon being informed of the plan, promptly developed a twitch in his left eye. The Duke of Marwick threatened to resign, then remembered he enjoyed his various tax exemptions too much to follow through. Even Lady Eleonora, who had defended the Queen through all previous eccentricities, could only stare in silent horror at the velvet-clad vegetable. Only the Queen remained oblivious. "This will change everything," she declared as she handed the box to the royal envoy, a long-suffering man named Geoffrey, who had somehow survived every royal whim thus far. "Viridia will see that we're a people of vision." Geoffrey, who had once negotiated a peace treaty during a siege, and considered that experience less stressful than his current assignment, accepted the box with the grim resignation of a man walking to his execution. The reception in Viridia went precisely as well as anyone with common sense might have predicted. Upon being presented with Sir Tuberous at a formal court ceremony, Prince Florian blinked at the vegetable for a full minute before turning to his advisers and asking, in a dangerously calm voice, if this was some kind of joke. When Geoffrey explained, with admirable professionalism, that no, this was indeed the Queen's chosen diplomatic representative, the prince's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a disturbing purple. "This," he announced to the assembled court, "is an insult to the dignity of Viridia." Geoffrey, sweating profusely, attempted damage control. "Your Highness, Her Majesty intended this as a gesture of—" "A gesture?" Prince Florian interrupted, his voice rising. "We are not children to be placated with novelty vegetables. Does your Queen think so little of us that she sends a root to discuss matters of state? I assure you, Sir Tuberous is a turnip of exceptional quality." The prince's patience, already threadbare, snapped. He seized the velvet-clad turnip from its box, and in full view of the court, hurled it against the nearest wall. Sir Tuberous exploded in a shower of wax-preserved vegetable matter, his tiny robe fluttering pathetically to the floor. A stunned silence fell. Then the laughter started. At first it was just a few stifled giggles from the younger courtiers, but soon the entire hall was roaring. The prince, his anger momentarily forgotten, joined in. Even Geoffrey, despite knowing the diplomatic catastrophe this represented, felt his lips twitch at the absurdity of it all. By nightfall, ballads were being composed about the great turnip ambassadorship, and Viridia's court jesters were having the most profitable week of their careers. News traveled fast. Within days, neighboring kingdoms were howling with laughter. The Queen's envoy to the Free Cities was greeted with a ceremonial platter of roasted vegetables in honor of her innovative diplomacy. The mountain clans of the north sent a crate of particularly phallic-shaped carrots with a note suggesting these might make better envoys. Even the usually somber monastic orders got involved, debating whether a turnip could technically receive last rites after its violent demise. Back in the Queen's court, the mood was considerably less jovial. Geoffrey's report, delivered with the careful tone of a man who valued his head, sent the Queen to a rage unlike anything the court had seen before. "They destroyed Sir Tuberous? she shrieked, her voice echoing through the throne room. That was a royal ambassador, an act of war. The Chancellor, who had been mentally composing his resignation letter since this whole affair began, cleared his throat. Your Majesty, with all due respect, one cannot declare war over a vegetable. The hell I can't. The ensuing emergency council meeting lasted 7 hours, and accomplished precisely nothing, aside from giving the royal scribe a permanent headache from trying to record the increasingly deranged suggestions. The Duke of Marwick proposed banning Viridian wine imports, which everyone knew would hurt their own nobility more than anyone else. Lady Eleonora suggested sending a strongly worded letter, though even she seemed doubtful this would suffice. The royal marshal, misunderstanding the assignment entirely, began drawing up plans to besiege Viridia with trebuchets loaded with rotten produce. Only Hob, who had been reluctantly dragged into the discussions, dared voice the obvious. Maybe, he ventured during a rare lull in the shouting, this was a bad idea. The Queen turned on him with a glare that had felled lesser men. You supported this. I said diplomacy was like farming, Hob protested. I didn't say to send an actual turnip. The Queen opened her mouth to retort, then paused. A strange expression crossed her face. Part frustration, part dawning realization. The court held its breath as she slowly sank back into her throne, her fingers tapping restlessly against the armrests. For the first time in her reign, the Queen looked uncertain. The silence stretched. Then, without another word, she stood and walked out, leaving her advisers to exchange bewildered glances. That night, the Queen did something unprecedented. She went alone to the royal gardens and sat among the turnips without singing to them, naming them, or trying to commune spiritually. She simply sat, staring at the dirt as the moon rose overhead. And in Viridia, Prince Florian, now somewhat embarrassed by his outburst, stared at the crumpled remains of Sir Tuberous' velvet robe and wondered if perhaps he'd overreacted. Somewhere between the two kingdoms, balanced precariously on the edge of war and ridicule, the fate of international relations hung in the balance. And all because of a vegetable. Chapter 8. The Underground Turnip Cult. The Queen's humiliation over the diplomatic turnip fiasco had a curious effect on the court. While most nobles breathed sighs of relief that her vegetable obsession might finally wane, a small but peculiar faction saw something else entirely: divine revelation. It began with Lady Winifred, a minor noblewoman of questionable ancestry and abundant superstition. She had been present when the Queen first proclaimed turnips equal to nobles, had wept openly during the festival of the humble turnip, and had even attempted to knit tiny vestments for the palace garden's most promising specimens. To her, the Queen's passion was not madness, but prophecy. "The signs are everywhere," she whispered to her handmaid one evening, clutching a particularly gnarled turnip to her chest. "The way the moon reflects off their pale flesh, the sacred geometry of their roots. Her Majesty didn't lose her senses, she gained vision." The handmaid, who had been paid extra to pretend her mistress wasn't deranged, nodded along. By morning, 3 other impressionable courtiers had been recruited into what Lady Winifred called the Sacred Order of the Earth's Bounty. Their first meeting took place in the palace's old wine cellar, chosen for its damp atmosphere and lack of witnesses. A turnip swaddled in silk rested on an upturned barrel, illuminated by a ring of candles that threw eerie shadows against the stone walls. Lady Winifred, draped in a hastily dyed turnip purple cloak, raised her hands. "Brothers and sisters of the tuber," she intoned, "we gather tonight to honor the humble vessel of the divine. Let us meditate upon its roundness, its earthy aroma, its—" "Shouldn't we give it a name?" interrupted Lord Pembleton, a gangly young man whose primary qualifications for joining the cult were his general credulity and a childhood fear of carrots. Lady Winifred considered this. "All turnips are aspects of the one true turnip," she declared. "But, yes, this one can be Brother Lumpkin." And so the rituals began. They were a haphazard mix of pagan agricultural rites, half-remembered religious ceremonies, and whatever theatrical flourishes Lady Winifred thought looked impressive. There were chants, "From soil we come, to soil we return," offerings, mostly compost, and a rather uncomfortable dance meant to mimic the growth cycle of root vegetables. News of these gatherings spread in hushed tones through the servant quarters. The butler claimed to have seen them bowing to a turnip on a velvet pillow. A scullery maid swore she heard them singing a hymn titled "Ode to a Well-Drained Bed." The rumors grew wilder with each retelling. Soon it was said they were sacrificing rats to ensure good harvests, and drinking turnip juice to gain visions. The Queen, still licking her wounds from the Viridia incident, remained unaware of this development. She had taken to walking the gardens at night, brooding over her missteps. It was during one such stroll that she stumbled upon the cult's third meeting. Drawn by a flickering candlelight from the usually dark orchard, she found a circle of cloaked figures kneeling before a makeshift altar. An upturned wheelbarrow bearing not just one turnip, but an entire pyramid of them, crowned by a gold-painted specimen wearing a tiny crown. Lady Winifred stood before the arrangement, her arms raised to the moon. "And so we pray to thee, O tubers most sacred, bless us with thy starchy wisdom." The Queen blinked. "What in the name of—" The cult froze. Lady Winifred spun around, her face draining of color as she recognized the silhouette in the moonlight. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then with a collective shriek, the assembled nobles scrambled to hide their ceremonial vegetables, knocking over candles in their panic. The Queen stepped forward, her initial shock giving way to bewildered amusement. "Are you worshipping turnips?" Lady Winifred fell to her knees. "Your Majesty, we were merely, that is to say—" Her voice failed as she realized there was no plausible explanation. To everyone's surprise, the Queen burst out laughing. Not the polite titter of courtly decorum, but a full, hearty guffaw that left her wiping tears from her eyes. "Oh, this is too perfect," she gasped. "After everything, the laws, the banquet, the diplomatic disaster, now there's an actual turnip cult?" The gathered nobles exchanged nervous glances. Lord Pembleton, ever the optimist, ventured a smile. Does this mean you approve?" The Queen's laughter died abruptly. "Approve? Of course not. This is absurd." She waved a hand at their makeshift altar. "Turnips are marvelous, yes, but they're vegetables, not deities." A pained silence followed. Then, from the back of the group, a timid voice piped up. "But you said they were equal to nobles." The Queen opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at the crestfallen faces before her, at the gold-painted turnip still teetering on its pyramid, at Lady Winifred's trembling lower lip. Something in her expression softened. With a sigh, she reached down and picked up the nearest fallen turnip, brushing dirt from its surface. "Listen," she said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I may have gotten carried away, but this—" She gestured to their setup. "This is too far. You can't just invent a religion because your queen has questionable hobbies." Lady Winifred sniffled. "But the visions were probably from breathing too much cellar mold." The Queen tossed the turnip in the air and caught it. However, a mischievous glint entered her eye. "If you're so determined to celebrate turnips, perhaps we could redirect this enthusiasm. The Royal Agricultural Fair could use more judges for the root vegetable competition." The cult perked up. "We'd get to wear special sashes," asked one hopeful member. "And use scoring paddles," added another. The Queen nodded. "Within reason." And so the Sacred Order of the Earth's Bounty became the far less heretical Royal Society for the Appreciation of Root Vegetables. Their meetings moved above ground, their rituals were replaced with sensible tasting notes, and Lady Winifred's purple cloak was repurposed as a rather stylish tablecloth for awards ceremonies. As for the gold-painted turnip, The queen kept it on her windowsill as a reminder, not of divinity, but of how easily enthusiasm could curdle into madness. Though she did, on occasion, catch herself talking to it, just in case. Chapter 9. The Plague of Puns. The Queen's newfound restraint regarding actual turnip legislation did nothing to curb her enthusiasm for turnip-powered play. What began as harmless jesting among the Royal Society for the appreciation of root vegetables soon spread like a particularly virulent weed through every level of society. The kingdom had survived turnip equality laws, turnip diplomacy, and even a turnip cult, but nothing could have prepared its citizens for the linguistic apocalypse that followed. The first signs appeared in the royal decrees. Where once proclamations had been written in stately, formal language, they now brimmed with vegetable-based double entendres. A tax notice reminded citizens that failure to pay would root them in financial difficulty. A declaration about road repairs urged travelers to expect delays as we internopie the thoroughfares. The Queen herself took to ending official correspondence with yours G. much to her scribe's despair. The courtiers, desperate to curry favor, quickly adopted the trend. Lord Pembroke, never one for originality, began inserting lettuce, turnip, the beet into every conversation regardless of context. Lady Eleanora developed a habit of sighing, "Oh my Gordy," at even the mildest inconveniences. The Chancellor, normally a bastion of dignity, once accidentally referred to the Treasury as our national rooty cellar during foreign negotiations, and had to be physically restrained from leaping out a window in shame. But the true horror began when the puns escaped the nobility and took hold among the common folk. Market vendors hawked their wares with cries of "Don't be rootless, buy fresh turnips." Street urchins developed a game called stalk or be stalked. Even the kingdom's usually stoic blacksmith hung a sign declaring "Forge tuber" or "Forge not at all." The once proud land now echoed with ceaseless vegetable wordplay from sunrise to sunset. The church fared no better. The bishop's Sunday sermons now included phrases like "Let us pray for a bountiful harvest," and warnings against those who would squashen the spirit of charity. A particularly unfortunate incident occurred during a royal wedding when the officiating priest asked if anyone had objections to the union. "Speak now or forever. Hold your yea peas." The groom's family still hadn't forgiven him. The military proved especially vulnerable to the trend. The Royal Guard adopted new vegetable-themed marching chants, left, right, road. The Navy's ships were rechristened with names like Kai the Starchy Marinari and Each Eder Guy. During one ill-fated training exercise, an entire battalion became distracted debating whether turnips could be considered rudimentary troops. Education suffered terribly. Schoolchildren learned arithmetic through turnip-based word problems. If Sir Tuba has 5 roots and Lady Turnipina has 3, grammar lessons focused on constructing proper tuberative sentences. The royal historian was pressured to reinterpret major battles as having been decided by superior rooty tactics. The final straw came when foreign diplomats began reporting home about the phenomenon. Feridia's ambassador wrote to his king that negotiating with these people is impossible. Every sentence contains some damnable vegetable reference. The mountain clan sent a terse message stating they would resume trade talks only if the root jokes stem immediately. Even the usually tolerant monks of the White Order complained that the constant puns were testing our vows of patience. Matters reached a crisis point during the trial of a notorious bandit. The judge, swept up in the trend, ruled that the criminal would be given a Ikaye Fairy trial followed by a rooty execution. When the bewildered man asked if this meant hanging or beheading, the judge cheerfully explained it meant being buried up to his neck in turnip fields, until you turnipy a new leaf. The bandit promptly confessed to every crime ever committed in the kingdom, just to escape the conversation. The Queen remained oblivious to the suffering she'd unleashed, until the day she overheard two scullery maids talking. "Pass me that pillar of state," one giggled. "Only if you irelishing the thought," the other countered before both collapsed into helpless laughter. For the first time the Queen heard not clever wordplay, but the desperate scraping of a kingdom's collective wit against the bottom of the humor barrel. That evening she summoned her advisers. "Perhaps," she ventured carefully, "we've taken the turnip enthusiasm too far linguistically." The chamber erupted in applause so violent that several nobles strained their hands. The Chancellor wept openly. Lady Eleonora fainted from relief. The next morning a royal decree appeared across the kingdom, written in completely pun-free language, declaring an immediate end to compulsory vegetable-based humor. First-time offenders would be fined, repeat offenders sentenced to read agricultural manuals aloud in the town square. The kingdom collectively sighed in relief. Though occasionally in dark tavern corners one might still hear whispered "no Uprooting, no glory between conspirators." Some habits, like stubborn weeds, proved difficult to eradicate completely. Chapter 10. The Winter of Root Vegetables. The Queen's turnip mania had always been tolerated as harmless eccentricity, until the day it threatened the kingdom's very survival. It began innocently enough with a royal proclamation suggesting farmers might consider increasing their turnip yields. Within a month, this gentle suggestion had hardened into law. All arable land would dedicate at least half its acreage to turnips. By harvest season, the decree had escalated further. All other crops were banned entirely. The royal seal on this order still glistened with fresh wax when Hob came staggering into the throne room, his face ashen. "Your Majesty," he gasped, still clutching the offending parchment. "You can't mean this." The Queen barely looked up from her latest project. Miniature turnip-sized crowns for next year's festival. "Of course I do. Imagine it, Hob. A kingdom united under one glorious vegetable. But we'll starve." Hope's calloused hands trembled as he spread a farmer's almanac across the marble floor. "Turnips can't sustain us through winter alone. Wheat for bread, barley for beer, cabbage for—" "Nonsense." The Queen waved away his concerns with a jeweled hand. "Our ancestors survived on far less. Besides, think of the trade opportunities. We'll be known across the realms as the Turnip Kingdom." Across the farmlands, the news spread like blight. Farmers stared in horror at their half-grown wheat fields now ordered plowed under. The Millers' Guild revolted immediately. No wheat meant no flour meant no bread, and no bread meant certain unrest. But the Queen, in her turnip-blinded zeal, dismissed their petitions with a rhyming couplet about the noble root's superior suit. By mid-autumn, the first signs of disaster appeared. The market squares, usually bursting with autumn abundance, displayed nothing but endless piles of turnips in various states of preparation. Pickled turnips, dried turnips, turnip flour, a gray, choking powder that made bread resembling damp mortar. The price of salt skyrocketed as households tried desperately to preserve something, anything, for the coming winter. The court physicians warned of scurvy. The brewers predicted riots when the beer ran out. Even the royal chef, that long-suffering artist of the kitchen, submitted his resignation after being ordered to create a 50-course turnip banquet. "I still have standards," his note read, "even if my queen does not." Still, the Queen remained obstinate. When the Chancellor presented reports of food shortages in the northern provinces, she suggested they boil their turnips longer. When the bishop warned of peasant unrest, she commissioned turnip-themed stained-glass windows for the cathedral to inspire devotion. When the Duke of Marwick collapsed during counsel from turnip-induced malnutrition, she praised his commitment to the cause. The breaking point came on the first frost-bitten morning of winter. A delegation of peasants arrived at the palace gates. Not the usual meek petitioners, but hard-eyed men and women carrying farming tools and the last withered apples from their slaughtered orchards. Hope stood at their front, his face gaunt from 2 months of turnip gruel. "We won't do it," he said simply when admitted to the throne room. "We're planting wheat." The Queen's smile faltered. That's treason. So starving your people, Hob countered. Behind him, the peasants stood firm, their breath visible in the unheated hole. For the first time in her reign, the queen saw something terrifying in her subjects' eyes. Not admiration, not exasperated tolerance, but genuine rage. The kind that toppled crowns. The royal guards shifted nervously, their loyalty wavering between duty and their own growling stomachs. The nobles present, all noticeably thinner than at summer's end, found suddenly compelling reasons to examine the tapestries. Even Lady Winifred of the Turnip cult had the good sense to remain silent. A log cracked in the fireplace. Somewhere in the palace, a servant's stomach growled loud enough to echo through the silent hall. The queen opened her mouth, perhaps to command obedience, perhaps to order arrests, then stopped. Her gaze fell upon a peasant child, clutching a half-rotten turnip like a grim talisman. Slowly, like frost receding from a window pane, the madness cleared from her eyes. The decree was rescinded that afternoon. Seed grain was distributed from the royal stores. The farmers returned to their fields to salvage what they could before true winter set in. That night, the queen dined alone in her chambers. The plate before her held a single roasted turnip, plain and unadorned. She studied it for a long moment before taking the first bite, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, as if truly tasting it for the first time. Outside, snow began to fall on a kingdom that would never look at root vegetables quite the same way again. Chapter 11. The Assassination Attempt by Beetroot Lobbyists. The Queen's turnip obsession had created many victims across the kingdom, but none suffered more acutely than the beetroot farmers. Once proud producers of the realm's second most popular root vegetable, they had watched in horror as turnip propaganda infiltrated every level of society. Their traditional markets vanished. Their children came home from school singing turnip hymns, and worst of all, the annual Beetroot Festival had been unceremoniously renamed the Lesser Root Celebration. In the dimly lit back room of the Crimson Root Tavern, the last remaining beetroot growers gathered in emergency session. Old man Yerrick, whose family had cultivated dark blood beets for 7 generations, pounded a gnarled fist on the ale-stained table. "That madwoman's trying to erase us from history," he rasped, his face nearly matching his crop's distinctive hue. "First our fields, then our festivals, now they're even changing recipes. I saw a tavern serving turnip borscht yesterday." A horrified gasp circled the room. Marta Beesbury, the only woman in the Beetroot Brotherhood, and by far the most dangerous, slowly unwrapped a cloth bundle to reveal a single, perfect beet. "This," she declared in a voice trembling with emotion, "is what we're fighting for." The others nodded solemnly, some wiping away tears. Their plan was simple, elegant and utterly mad. They would assassinate the queen using the very vegetable she had scorned. The opportunity came during the queen's visit to the Royal Agricultural Exhibition. While most displays predictably focused on turnips, turnip carvings, turnip-based building materials, an unfortunate turnip ballet, the beetroot contingent had been grudgingly allotted a small corner near the composting demonstrations. Marta, disguised as a humble farmer's wife, prepared her weapon, a stunning beetroot salad with horseradish dressing, laced with just enough mandrake root to induce a deep, hopefully fatal sleep. The Brotherhood had debated using deadlier poisons, but Yerrick had argued convincingly that they should keep some dignity in our vengeance. When the Queen's procession reached their stall, the beetroot farmers bowed with exaggerated humility. "Your Majesty," Marta simpered, offering the gleaming purple dish, "we humbly present the superior root vegetable you've been denying yourself." The Queen, still somewhat chastened from the winter famine, hesitated. The salad did look remarkably appealing, ruby-red slices arranged in a sunflower pattern, glistening with oil and herbs. For the first time in years, she found herself craving something that wasn't turnip-based. Just as her fingers touched the fork, Hob came barreling through the crowd. "Your Majesty, thank goodness I caught you." He knocked the plate aside with a dramatic flourish, sending purple-stained greens flying across the royal gown. A stunned silence fell over the exhibition hall. Marta's eyes darted toward the exit. Yarrick began inching backward into the compost display. Hope picked up a surviving beet slice and sniffed it dramatically. "Mandrake," he declared. "Enough to put a bull to sleep for a week." The Queen's Guard sprang into action, seizing the Beetroot assassins with surprising enthusiasm. The royal household had eaten nothing but turnips for months, and they harbored considerable resentment. In the aftermath, as the would-be assassins were dragged away, Marta shouting "Vive la Beetvolution," the Queen stared at the ruined salad. A single untouched beet slice remained on the edge of the plate. Slowly, almost reverently, she picked it up and took a bite. The flavor exploded across her palate, earthy yet sweet with a hint of iron and summer soil. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, I'd forgotten." That evening a new decree went out across the kingdom. The beetroot ban was lifted. Farmers could once again grow what they pleased. The lesser root celebration reverted to its original name, and in the palace kitchens, the newly reinstated royal chef prepared a modest dish of roasted beets, just for the Queen's table. As for the Beetroot Brotherhood, they received surprisingly light sentences, mostly involving community service in the royal gardens. Old Man Yarrick later admitted this was a fair punishment, though he maintained to his dying day that the mandrake had been just a light seasoning. Chapter 12. The Queen's Turnip-Themed Nightmares. The Queen has spent years romanticizing the turnip's simple existence. Its quiet life nestled in the soil, untouched by court intrigue or the burdens of rule. She had written poetry about their stoic endurance of rain and sun, praised their uncomplaining nature, even envied their uncomplicated purpose. But now, for the first time, she dreamed of what it truly meant to obey one. It began as a pleasant fantasy. In her sleep, she felt herself sinking into warm, dark earth. Her limbs, or what she imagined as limbs, spreading comfortably through the loam. The sun was a distant glow above, dappling her leaves. She had no thoughts, only sensations, the moisture in the soil, the slow pulse of growth. It was peaceful. It was perfect. Then the hands came. She felt them before she saw them, through fingers closing around her greens, wrenching her upward with a single brutal yank. The shock of being torn from the earth was worse than any physical pain she had ever known. It was violation. Her dream self, her turnip self, was tossed into a basket, jostled against others of her kind. Some were still damp from the soil, their roots limp and exposed. Some had been split by careless harvesting, their pale flesh bared to the air. None spoke. None protested. They simply waited, silent and helpless, as the basket was carried toward an uncertain fate. The Queen awoke gasping, her sheets tangled around her like grasping roots. The nightmare returned the next night, and the next. Each time, the details grew more vivid. Sometimes she was stored in a cellar, listening to the slow rot of her companions. Sometimes she was peeled alive, the knife stripping away her skin in long, curling ribbons. Worst of all were the dreams where she was boiled, conscious but unable to scream as the water heated around her, her flesh softening, breaking apart. She stopped eating turnips altogether. The court noticed, of course. The Queen's sudden aversion to her once beloved vegetable did not go unremarked. Lady Eleanora speculated that the beetroot incident had traumatized her. The Chancellor hoped it signaled a return to more traditional ruling habits. Hope, who had always understood her odd obsession better than most, simply watched her with quiet concern. One evening, as she walked the gardens to avoid sleep, he found her staring at a freshly harvested turnip patch, the soil still disturbed from their uprooting. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "The turnips don't scream when you pull them up," she murmured, not looking at him. Hope hesitated. "No," he agreed. "They don't." But do they wanting to? The question hung in the air between them. Hope, who had harvested crops since childhood, who had never once ascribed feelings to vegetables, surprised himself by actually considering it. "Don't know," he said at last. "But if they did, we'd never hear it, and we'd still have to eat." The queen shuddered. That night she dreamed again. This time she was stored in a dark sack, waiting. Around her, other turnips slowly succumbed to mold. She could feel it creeping over her skin, consuming her. She woke with a cry and summoned the royal gardener before dawn. "Tell me," she demanded, still in her night clothes, "do turnips feel?" Thaddeus, who had been wrenched from sleep, and now stood blinking in the throne room, rubbed his beard. "Feel, your majesty? Pain, fear. Do they know when they're being harvested?" The old gardener stared at her. Then, with the bluntness of a man who had spent 50 years with his hands in dirt and no patience for nonsense, he said, "No." The queen exhaled. "But," Thaddeus added, "they fight to live all the same. Ever seen a turnip grow through a crack in stone, or resprout after you've cut its greens? They don't wanting to die. Nothing does." The words settled over her like a revelation. That evening, she dined on roasted turnips, not with her former obsession, but with something quieter, respect. And when she dreamed, it was of ordinary things. Court documents, trade agreements, the petty squabbles of nobles. She woke refreshed. In the gardens, new turnip seedlings pushed through the soil, reaching blindly for the sun. Chapter 13. The Philosopher's Treatise on Vegetable Consciousness. The queen's nightmares might have faded, but the questions they raised lingered like the scent of turned earth after rain. She took to wandering the palace library, searching for ancient texts on plant sentience, paging through herbals with unusual intensity. The court noticed, as courts always do, and where royalty shows interest, sycophants soon follow. Enter Philosopher Durvin, a man whose prodigious beard contained more wisdom than his head, and whose unshakable confidence in his own intellect had survived 7 failed treatises on topics ranging from the moral implications of left-handedness to an exhaustive study of why bread always falls butter side down. Sensing an opportunity to finally gain the queen's favor, he set to work on what he called Guide Vegetative Soul, a discourse on turnip consciousness and other edible philosophy. The document arrived at court bound in suspiciously fresh leather, its pages smelling faintly of desperation and ink. Durvin presented it personally, dropping the heavy tome on the council table with a thud that made the chancellor's wine goblet tremble. "Your Majesty," he intoned, stroking his beard with practiced gravitas, "I have uncovered irrefutable proof that turnips possess not merely life, but souls." The queen, who had been enjoying a brief respite from vegetable-related madness, felt the familiar itch of curiosity stir. "Explain." Durvin needed no further encouragement. Over the next hour, he expounded upon his discoveries with the fervor of a prophet. Turnips, he claimed, communicated through subtle vibrations in the soil. Their spiral root growth patterns formed a language as complex as Hebrew. When chopped, they released a silent scream detectable only to those with properly attuned souls. As evidence, he presented carefully drawn diagrams of turnip cross-sections that supposedly revealed faces frozen in expressions of vegetable ecstasy. The court listened in varying states of horror and fascination. The bishop kept making the sign of the cross. The chancellor developed a sudden cough that suspiciously resembled suppressed laughter. Only Lady Winifred, the former leader of the turnip cult, nodded along with beatific approval. The queen, however, found herself transfixed. Durvin's arguments were absurd, yes, but what if there was a kernel of truth? Hadn't she herself felt their silent suffering in her dreams? "Your Majesty," the chancellor interjected, sensing disaster, "surely we have more pressing matters than vegetable metaphysics? More pressing than the very nature of existence?" Dorwin countered. Then whether we commit genocide with every stew. A maid fainted near the pastry cart. The queen, ignoring the chaos, took the treatise to her chambers that night. By candlelight, she pored over Derwin's ludicrous proofs. A section titled The Pythagorean Paradox. If a turnip is shared between two men, where goes its soul? Painstaking records of turnip growth rates during different phases of the moon, proving lunar awareness. An entire chapter devoted to sacrificial lamb and sacrificial yam. Comparative theology of edible martyrs. Somewhere around the claim that boiled turnips released ectoplasmic vapor visible to virgins, the queen began to question her own interest. But then she reached Derwin's pièce de résistance, a hand-drawn illustration of the great chain of being with turnips placed just below angels and considerably above merchants. Something in the sheer audacity of it broke through her lingering doubts. She burst out laughing, the sound startling her attendants in the next room. The next morning she summoned Derwin to the throne room. The philosopher arrived, preening, already composing in his head the speech he would give when named Royal Vegetable Theologian. "Your work," the queen declared, "is the most complete nonsense I have ever read." Derwin's beard seemed to deflate. "And yet," she continued, "it has made me realize something important." The court leaned forward. Was this the moment their queen finally denounced turnips altogether? The queen stood, her gown rustling. "If we must debate whether vegetables have souls, then we've clearly run out of actual problems to solve." She turned to the chancellor. "Schedule a meeting about the Southern Bridge repairs, and someone bring me an apple. Just an ordinary, untheological apple." Derwin spluttered. "But the evidence—" "Us creative enough to earn you a position," the queen interrupted. "We're starting a royal theater company. You'll write their first play." And so the tragical history of Sir Tuberous premiered the following month to mixed reviews. The scene where the turnip protagonist soliloquized about soil conditions before being murdered by a carrot was particularly divisive. As for the treatise, the queen kept it on her bedside table, not as scripture but as a reminder of how easily one could lose perspective. And if occasionally, when passing the kitchens, she still hesitated before ordering turnip soup, well, some habits died harder than others. Chapter 14. The Grand Turnip Ball. The Queen's newfound self-awareness did not extend to cancelling what would become the most infamous social event of the century. Having promised the Royal Society for the Appreciation of Root Vegetables an annual celebration, she found herself honor-bound to host what the invitations termed a grand masquerade of earthly delights, though everyone knew it simply as the Turnip Ball. The decree that all attendees must come, dressed as root vegetables, caused immediate uproar among the nobility. The Duke of Marek famously declared he would rather attend court naked than waltz about looking like produce, until he learned the Queen had commissioned an armored turnip costume incorporating his actual family crest. Even Lady Eleonora, normally the Queen's staunchest supporter, spent 3 days trying to convince her seamstress that a very tall, thin carrot might technically qualify as a root vegetable. On the night of the ball, the palace glittered with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off decorations that tastefully blended royal grandeur with agricultural absurdity. Crystal chandeliers hung entwined with turnip vines. The grand staircase was lined with baskets of heirloom vegetables instead of flowers, and the herald announced guests not by their titles, but by their chosen vegetable and variety. Announcing his grace, the Duke of Marek, the herald called, as a regal golden globe turnip. The Duke entered with all the dignity a man could muster while wearing a gilded vegetable costume that made him look like an ambulatory paperweight. His wife, the Duchess, followed as a demure scarlet radish, her fashionable silhouette only slightly compromised by the trailing root tenders affixed to her skirt. Lady Winifred arrived as the mystic mandrake, her costume complete with disturbingly accurate root formations that prompted the bishop to bless himself repeatedly. The chancellor came as a practical parsnip, which everyone agreed perfectly suited his personality. Even Hope had been persuaded to attend as a humble field turnip, though he refused the accompanying greens as a headpiece, muttering about lines that shouldn't be crossed. The Queen made her entrance last, descending the staircase in a masterpiece of sartorial absurdity. Her gown bloomed outward in layers of cream and purple silk, mimicking the cross-section of a perfect turnip. Tiny seed pearls formed root hairs along the hem, and her headdress sprouted delicate silver leaves that trembled with each step. She carried a scepter topped with an actual golden turnip that had been polished to a mirror shine. "My fellow roots," she declared with only the barest hint of irony, "let the revels begin." What followed was an evening of unparalleled strangeness. The orchestra, under strict instructions, played only vegetable-themed compositions, including the now infamous turnip sonata that sounded suspiciously like regular music played while chewing a handkerchief. The dancing progressed with reasonable grace until the raideish gallop left several elderly nobles needing assistance. The supper proved particularly challenging. The royal chef, having learned from previous disasters, prepared a balanced menu, only for guests to realize the irony of eating vegetable dishes while dressed as vegetables. Lady Eleanora was seen discreetly feeding her carrot-shaped headpiece to a dog. The highlight, or low point, depending on one's perspective, came during the best in soil costume judging. The Queen, serving as head judge, found herself facing impossible choices. Was the Countess of Wexford's diamond-encrusted jewel yam more impressive than the Viscount's historically accurate, prehistoric wild turnip reconstruction? Did the ambassador's exotic cassava trump traditional local varieties? Matters came to a head when the Duke of Marwick accused Baron Pembleton of cheating by dressing as a rare black turnip that no one could verify existed. The resulting argument escalated until the two noblemen, their vegetable costumes wobbling precariously, nearly came to blows before the Queen intervened. "Gentlemen," she declared, stepping between a giant golden turnip and what appeared to be an oversized beet painted black. "This is a celebration of all roots, real and imagined. There will be no fighting in the vegetable patch." As midnight approached, the ball reached its surreal crescendo with the grand root procession. Led by the Queen, all 200 guests formed a snaking line through the palace, their costumes creating a living tapestry of agricultural absurdity. From above, it might have looked like the world's most elaborate salad had suddenly grown legs and decided to go for a stroll. When the final guests departed near dawn, the Duke of Marwick's gilded costume noticeably dented, Lady Winifred having traded her mandrake roots for a pair of comfortable slippers, the Queen collapsed onto her throne, still half-dressed in her turnip regalia. "Well," she said to Hob, who had remained stubbornly human-shaped throughout the evening, "that was certainly something." Hope, who had spent the night watching nobles make fools of themselves and found himself surprisingly entertained, allowed a small smile. "Suppose it was, Your Majesty." The Queen plucked a silver turnip leaf from her hair and twirled it thoughtfully. "Do you think we went too far?" Hope considered the question, then gestured to where the Chancellor slept peacefully in a corner, still wearing his parsnip costume. "Not far enough, if you ask me." The Queen laughed, and in that moment all the madness, the laws, the cults, the diplomatic incidents, felt worth it. Some monarchs had wars to define their reigns. Others built great monuments. She would be remembered for making an entire kingdom dress as vegetables for one gloriously ridiculous night. And strangely enough, that seemed exactly right. Chapter 15. The Royal Gardener's Secret Plot. Old Thaddeus attended the palace gardens through 3 monarchs, 2 plagues, and what historians would later call the great topiary blight of his middle years. He prided himself on his patience, his pragmatism, and his ability to grow roses that could make visiting dignitaries weep with their perfection. But the Queen's turnip obsession had tested even his legendary forbearance. The breaking point came when she demanded he uproot the historic moonlight petunias, cultivated by 6 generations of royal gardeners, to make room for yet another experimental turnip patch. As his shears snipped through decades of careful cultivation, something inside Thaddeus snapped like a dried pea pod. That evening, in the potting shed he called both workplace and home, the old gardener lit his pipe and plotted horticultural revenge. If the queen wanted turnips, he'd give her turnips, just not the kind she expected. The next morning, Thaddeus began his clandestine breeding program. He started with the robust golden-globed turnips the queen favored, but crossed them with their wild, bitter cousins from the northern moors. He experimented with grafting techniques that produced lumpy, misshapen tubers. Under the pretense of scientific advancement, he petitioned for exotic varieties from distant lands, knobby yellow things that smelled vaguely of sulfur, purple monstrosities that leaked milky sap when cut. By harvest season, the royal gardens bore fruit that looked less like food and more like something a witch might use for cursing. There were turnips with hairy root systems resembling old men's beards, specimens that sprouted bizarre tumor-like growths, and one particularly disturbing cultivar that seemed to develop rudimentary facial features when left in moonlight. The queen, oblivious to Thaddeus's scheme, visited the gardens with her usual enthusiasm. "These are unusual," she remarked, poking at a turnip that appeared to be growing a second smaller turnip from its side. "Special new varieties, Your Majesty," Thaddeus said, stroking his chin with soil-stained fingers. "Very rare, very distinctive." The royal kitchens received the first harvest with horror. The head cook nearly resigned when a peeled turnip bled red sap onto his cutting board. The scullery maid assigned to scrub the vegetables developed a nervous twitch after encountering one that emitted a faint squeaking noise when handled. At dinner that evening, the queen took one bite of her roasted turnip medley and paused. "Thaddeus," she called out to where the gardener stood waiting in the shadows, "these taste unique, Your Majesty. Like someone boiled a shoe in vinegar." Thaddeus allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Ah, yes, that would be the new frostbane variety. Very nutritious, I'm told." Undeterret. The queen requested the turnips be prepared different ways, mashed, fried, even candied. Each preparation proved more horrifying than the last. The mashed version congealed into a glue-like substance that permanently affixed two dinner plates together. The candied attempt resulted in a crystalline growth that had to be removed from the pantry with a chisel. Still the queen persisted, her determination growing with each culinary disaster. She ordered the royal alchemists to study the unusual vegetables, convinced their strange properties must conceal some hidden virtue. The lead alchemist quit after a particularly volatile specimen exploded, coating his laboratory in foul-smelling purple foam. Meanwhile, Thaddeus continued his work, growing ever more grotesque hybrids. His masterpiece emerged in early winter, a turnip so unsettling that even the other gardeners refused to touch it. Nearly black in color, covered in wart-like protrusions, it seemed to pulse slightly when left alone in the cold frame. With great ceremony, Thaddeus presented this specimen to the queen. "The Black Prince turnip," he announced, "grown especially for Your Majesty." The queen reached out to touch it, then recoiled as the vegetable emitted a sound somewhere between a sigh and a death rattle. All color drained from her face. "Thaddeus," she said slowly, "are these turnips safe?" The old gardener pretended to consider the question. "Well, now, Your Majesty, plants have their own ways, don't they? Maybe some things aren't meant to be eaten. Maybe some things should just stay in the ground where they belong." A long silence followed. The queen stared at the pulsating turnip, then at Thaddeus's innocent expression, then back at the turnip. A slow realization dawned across her features. "You absolute bastard," she said, with something approaching admiration. Thaddeus bowed, hiding his smile in the motion. "Your Majesty is too kind." The next morning, a royal decree announced that while turnips would always hold a special place in the kingdom's heart, and fields, other vegetables were officially welcome back at court. The palace chef wept openly upon hearing the news. The Beetroot farmers declared a holiday. As for Thaddeus, he received no official recognition for his service to the realm. Just an extra barrel of cider delivered to his potting shed that winter, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing his moonlight petunias replanted where they belonged. The Black Prince Turnip was last seen being carried away by a group of very nervous alchemists, still making faint sighing noises in its crate. It was, everyone agreed, better not to ask. Chapter 16. The day the Queen disappeared. The morning dawned unusually quiet in the palace. No royal decrees about turnip appreciation were drafted. No gardeners were interrogated about soil composition. The Queen's chambers stood empty, her bed unslept in, the only sign of her presence being a single sheet of parchment placed neatly on the pillow. Gone to live among the turnips, it read in her looping script, "Do not follow." Chaos erupted when the note was discovered. The Chancellor, upon reading it, went through 7 distinct shades of purple before settling on a worrying gray. Lady Eleonora fainted directly into a waiting footman's arms. The Duke of Marek, in a rare moment of clarity, pointed out that this was exactly what they'd all been worried about for years. A search party was assembled with unprecedented speed. Royal guards combed every turnip patch within a day's ride of the palace, their armor clanking as they pushed through dense foliage. Farmers looked up from their work to see noblemen peering suspiciously at their crops, occasionally poking the dirt with jeweled cane. Hope led a contingent to the Queen's favorite fields, calling her name between the rows like a man searching for a lost dog. By afternoon, rumors spread like blight through the kingdom. A shepherd swore he'd seen a woman in a mud-stained gown walking north toward the high pastures. A tavern girl claimed a regal figure had purchased an entire sack of turnip seeds before vanishing into the mist. The more superstitious villagers crossed themselves and whispered about fairy abductions and cursed harvests. As dusk fell, the search parties returned empty-handed. The council gathered in the war room, maps of agricultural land spread across the table, debating increasingly desperate strategies. The Chancellor proposed offering rewards for information. The bishop suggested prayer. The royal chef, perhaps optimistically, recommended waiting until hunger drove her back. Only Thaddeus remained conspicuously silent, stroking his beard with dirt-stained fingers. When pressed, the old gardener merely shrugged. Maybe she found what she was looking for, he said, which satisfied no one but couldn't be argued with. Meanwhile, in a small, unremarkable turnip field near the western border, the Queen knelt in the dirt, her once fine gown ruined by mud, and her hair tangled with leaves. A farmer's rough-spun cloak lay discarded nearby, her crown left carefully atop it like a snail abandoning its shell. For hours she simply sat there, watching the turnips sway in the evening breeze, their leaves whispering secrets only she seemed to hear. The moon rose, silvering the field, and still she didn't move. Back at the palace, the council argued well into the night. It was Hob who finally silenced them with a single observation. If she wanted to be found, she wouldn't have gone to turnips. The truth was simpler than anyone guessed. The Queen, for all her madness, had realized something in Thaddeus's garden of horrors, that no matter how much he romanticized them, turnips were just roots in the dirt. And sometimes, so was she. When the sun rose, the farmer who owned the western field found a well-dressed woman asleep between his turnip rows, her face streaked with dirt and the peaceful expression of someone who had finally stopped running. He didn't recognize her but helped her up anyway, because that's what decent people did. The walk back to the palace took most of the day. The Queen arrived at dusk, her bare feet filthy, her hair full of twigs, and a single small turnip clutched in her hand. The guards nearly wept at the sight of her. The council rushed forward with questions, demands, exclamations of relief. The Queen silenced them with a raised hand. "I'm going to take a bath," she announced. "And then, I believe I'd like some roast chicken with potatoes." No one dared ask about the turnip still clutched in her hand. Some things, they were learning, were better left to mystery. And in the fields beyond the castle walls, the turnips grew as they always had, silent, uncomplaining, and utterly indifferent to the affairs of monarchs. Chapter 17. The Discovery in the Root Cellar. The Queen's brief return to sanity was, as it turned out, only temporary. A week after her muddy-footed homecoming, she vanished again, this time without even the courtesy of a note. The palace was thrown into a fresh panic, though this time the search was conducted with the grim efficiency of people who had already lived through this particular nightmare once before. The guards checked the gardens first. The council dispatched riders to the same western field where she had last been found. Hope, who had developed an unsettling knack for predicting the depths of the Queen's turnip-related madness, went straight to the root cellar. He found her buried up to her waist in loose soil, arms outstretched toward the slatted cellar window, where a thin shaft of pale sunlight filtered through. Her hair was tangled with straw, and her skin had taken on a sickly, pallid hue, stretched too tight over her bones. When Hope called her name, she turned slowly, blinking as if emerging from a dream. "Ah," she rasped, her voice dry as old husks. "You've come to see the experiment." Hope crouched beside her, careful not to startle her. "What experiment would that be, Your Majesty?" She smiled, then, a cracked and feverish thing. "Photosynthesis, Hope. The turnips don't eat, they don't drink, they just take from the sun." She lifted a trembling hand toward the light. "I wanted to see if I could do it too." Hope didn't bother arguing. He simply dug her out, brushing the dirt from her arms, her face, her tangled hair. When he tried to lift her, she resisted at first, her fingers clutching at the soil like roots clinging to the earth. But hunger and exhaustion had made her weak, and soon enough she slumped against him, her body light as a dried stalk. The court physician was summoned. The council was informed. The bishop, upon hearing the news, suggested an exorcism might be in order, though he was swiftly shouted down. The Queen was cleaned, dressed, and force-fed broth until some semblance of color returned to her face. When she was finally lucid enough to speak, the council gathered around her bed, a semicircle of stern faces waiting for an explanation. She gave them none. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and said, very quietly, "I think I almost felt it." No one asked what she meant. That evening, as the palace settled into an uneasy silence, Hob returned to the root cellar. The Queen's shallow burial plot was still there, the disturbed earth soft underfoot. Nearby, a single sprout had pushed through the dark soil, a volunteer turnip perhaps, or some other rogue seedling. Hope crouched beside it, studying the fragile green shoot in the dim light. Then, with a grunt, he uprooted it and tossed it onto the compost heap. Some experiments weren't worth repeating. Chapter 18. The Intervention of the Court Physician. The Queen's latest breakdown proved too much for even the most patient members of court. The Chancellor gathered the council in emergency session while she slept, his usual composure frayed at the edges. "This cannot continue," he declared, slamming a ledger onto the table hard enough to make the inkwell rattle. "We've indulged this madness long enough. It's time for professional intervention." The professional in question was Dr. Aldebrand, the royal physician, a man whose medical knowledge was only slightly less antiquated than the castle foundations. He arrived at the Queen's chambers carrying a black leather bag full of terrifying instruments, and a self-important air that suggested he'd been waiting his entire career for a case this delightfully bizarre. After a thorough examination that involved much tongue-depressing and pulse-taking, the doctor stepped back with the gravity of a man about to deliver a death sentence. "Your Majesty," he intoned, "is suffering from a most singular affliction. Phytosis mentis, vegetable psychosis." A hushed murmur spread through the gathered courtiers. Lady Eleanora gasped. The bishop made the sign of the cross. Hope, leaning against the far wall, rolled his eyes so hard it was audible. Dr. Aldebrand continued, undeterred. "The humors have become dangerously unbalanced. An excess of earth and water, a deficiency of fire and air. The cure is simple. Complete abstinence from all vegetable matter, and a strict regimen of roasted meats, crusty breads, and full-bodied red wines to restore equilibrium." The queen, propped up in bed with her hair still full of straw from her root cellar experiment, blinked slowly. "No turnips. Especially no turnips," the doctor confirmed. He produced a scroll from his bag, unfurling it with a flourish to reveal an elaborate dietary plan. "For the next fortnight, your majesty shall consume only animal flesh and grain products. No greens, no roots, not so much as a sprig of parsley for garnish." The royal chef, when informed of this new regimen, wept with joy and immediately began planning menus featuring every meat the kingdom could provide. Quail stuffed with lamb, beef pies swimming in gravy, whole roasted boars glistening with rendered fat. The kitchen staff, who had suffered through years of increasingly creative turnip preparations, celebrated by burning a turnip-shaped effigy in the courtyard. The first days were difficult. The queen picked at her meals like a petulant child, pushing slices of venison around her plate and sighing dramatically at the absence of her beloved tubers. She complained that the meat was too rich, the bread too dense, the wine too heavy. Dr. Aldebrand remained firm, diagnosing these complaints as withdrawal symptoms and prescribing more beef. By the third day, a curious thing happened. The queen awoke with actual hunger for the first time in memory. She devoured her breakfast of sausages and black bread with startling enthusiasm. At lunch, she requested second helpings of roasted pheasant. By dinner, she was discussing the merits of different aging techniques for mutton with a chef like a seasoned gourmand. The change in her demeanor was equally remarkable. The constant distracted air faded. She began attending to actual matters of state, settling border disputes, approving trade agreements, even, to the chancellor's tearful relief, reviewing the tax codes. The glassy, distant look in her eyes was replaced by something sharper, more present. At week's end, Dr. Aldebrand conducted a follow-up examination, pronouncing her humors sufficiently carnivorous. As a test, he had a single roasted turnip brought to the royal chambers. The queen regarded it with the wary fascination one might show a former lover who had caused great scandal. She took a small bite, chewed thoughtfully, then set it aside. "Odd," she mused. "It's just a turnip." The doctor nodded sagely. "Precisely, your majesty. Just a turnip." That night, for the first time in years, the queen dreamed of ordinary things: ships at sea, unfinished embroidery, a fox in the henhouse. Not a single root vegetable made an appearance. In the morning, she summoned Thaddeus to the royal gardens. The old gardener arrived expecting another bizarre request, perhaps to uproot the roses again or plant some new monstrosity. Instead, the queen simply handed him a small velvet pouch. "For your troubles," she said. Thaddeus peeked inside to find a generous heap of gold coins and one perfect, ordinary turnip seed. He pocketed the gold without comment. The seed he pressed back into her palm. "Best not push our luck, your majesty." The queen smiled, a real smile untouched by madness, and let the seed fall to the ground where it belonged. Chapter 19. The Edict of Uprooting. The queen's return to sanity proved as unsettling as her madness had been. The court, having grown accustomed to turnip laws and vegetable diplomacy, now found itself navigating the unfamiliar terrain of a monarch who wanted to discuss taxes, infrastructure, and, most unnerving of all, entirely ordinary matters of state. For weeks, an uneasy silence settled over the palace regarding the queen's former obsession. Servants tiptoed around any mention of root crops. The kitchen staff developed elaborate hand signals to avoid saying the forbidden word. Farmers presenting petitions carefully avoided discussing their harvests in any detail. It was as if the entire kingdom had developed a collective tic around the subject of turnips. The tension broke one crisp autumn morning when the queen summoned her council. They arrived to find her standing at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her hands clasped behind her back like a general preparing for battle. "Enough," she declared without preamble. "This absurd dance must end." The chancellor opened his mouth to reply, then thought better of it. The queen continued, her voice gaining strength. "From this day forward, No turnip shall be mentioned in my presence. No turnip-based dishes served at my table. No turnip metaphors in my court documents. The Royal Society for the Appreciation of Root Vegetables is hereby disbanded. The festival of the humble turnip will be renamed the Autumn Harvest Festival, and will celebrate. She paused, searching for the least offensive alternative. A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the chamber. The Duke's shoulders relaxed. The bishop stopped, nervously fingering his rosary. Only Lady Winifred looked faintly bereft, though she had the good sense to keep silent. The Queen's proclamation spread through the kingdom with remarkable speed. Within days, market vendors developed coded language for their wares, round whites for turnips, earth apples for potatoes. The royal chef burned his collection of turnip recipes in a ceremonial bonfire that attracted half the palace staff. Farmers, relieved to once again grow diverse crops without fear of royal reprisal, nevertheless kept small turnip patches out of habit, like sailors clinging to superstitions long after the storm has passed. Yet the Queen's edict proved harder to enforce than she anticipated. Turnips, after all, had infiltrated nearly every aspect of kingdom life during her reign. The royal crest still featured turnip leaves in its design. The palace gardens contained turnip-themed topiaries. Court musicians had composed dozens of turnip ballads that now had to be quietly retired. The breaking point came during a state dinner with the ambassador from Viridia. The Queen had just begun discussing trade agreements when a servant accidentally dropped a platter of roasted vegetables, including, unmistakably, several round white slices. The resulting silence stretched so long and became so profoundly uncomfortable that the ambassador finally cleared his throat and said, "Your Majesty, perhaps we should address the root vegetable in the room." To everyone's astonishment, the Queen laughed. Not the manic giggle of her turnip-obsessed days, but a genuine, hearty chuckle. "Indeed we should," she conceded. Then, with the air of a woman finally making peace with her own history, she added, "You may serve the turnips. Just..." The relief was palpable. Servants stopped walking on eggshells. The kitchen reintroduced turnip dishes to the menu, though never at the Queen's table. Farmers once again spoke openly of crop rotations. And the Queen, for her part, found she could walk past the vegetable gardens without either longing or revulsion. The turnips grew, as turnips do, neither more nor less important than any other crop. In the end, the Edict of Uprooting was quietly amended to a simple request: moderation in all things, vegetables included. The kingdom, having survived years of turnip mania, found this compromise eminently reasonable. And if occasionally, in the privacy of their homes, citizens still referred to particularly stubborn problems as turnip situations, well, some habits, like certain root vegetables, proved remarkably resilient. Chapter 20. The Legacy of the Turnip Queen. Time, as it tends to do, softened the edges of the Queen's reign. The years turned into decades, the decades into centuries, and what had once been a source of national embarrassment became instead a beloved legend. A story told with laughter and fondness, though never without a kernel of warning. The kingdom prospered in the years after the Queen's rule, its fields yielding balanced harvests of wheat and barley, of cabbages and carrots, and yes, even turnips, though never in excess. The royal crest was quietly redesigned, the turnip leaves replaced by sheaves of grain. But if one looked closely at the oldest tapestries in the palace halls, the original design could still be glimpsed beneath the embroidery, a ghost of vegetable obsession lingering in the thread. Children learned about the turnip queen in their lessons, though historians debated how much of the tale was fact and how much was folklore. Had she truly tried to become a turnip? Had she once declared them equal to nobles? Had an assassin really been sent by Beetroot lobbyists? The records were contradictory, but the people preferred the more outrageous versions, the ones where the queen's madness was grander, her schemes more absurd. In the countryside, farmers still told the story on winter nights, gathered around hearths with mugs of cider in hand. "Beware the lure of simple things," they'd say, shaking their heads, "for even a queen can lose herself in the dirt." And then, with a wink, they'd add, "But if you must dream of being a vegetable, make it something sturdy. A potato, perhaps, or a nice, dependable parsnip." The palace chefs, for their part, passed down the cautionary tale of the great turnip banquet to their apprentices. A balanced meal, they intoned, is the mark of civilization. Yet once a year, on the old date of the festival of the humble turnip, a single dish would appear on the royal table. Roasted turnips, golden and glazed, served without fanfare. The reigning monarch would eat one bite, for tradition's sake, and then move on to the rest of the meal. As for the queen herself, her grave was marked with a simple stone, its inscription worn smooth by time and weather. Only the oldest scholars could still decipher the words. "Here is a queen who dreamed of roots, one, of simpler lives and earthbound truths. In unto she too late, as all souls must. Tart crowns and turnips gather rust. And so the kingdom endured, its people wiser for having survived a reign of vegetable madness. They grew their turnips, ate them in moderation, and never, never let themselves forget the queen who had loved them too much. For though time softened the edges of the story, the lesson remained sharp as a gardener's spade. No soul, royal or common, can thrive on turnips alone. I see a handful.